"We're not funding this circus anymore." My mother's words hung in the air of her immaculate dining room like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. And I sat there across from her with my fiancé Jake's hand warm in mine under the table, feeling the familiar sting of dismissal wash over me, but also something new, something harder and clearer than the hurt I'd carried for 28 years. This was 3 months before my wedding, a Thursday evening in March, when the Chicago winter was finally loosening its grip, and I'd driven to my parents' house in Wilmette for what I thought would be a routine family dinner, the kind where my mother would critique the centerpiece choices I'd texted her, and my father would nod along while reading something on his phone, and my younger brother Brett would smirk from across the table, in that way that said he knew he'd always be the favored one. Jake sat beside me in his wool sweater and khakis, the high school English teacher, who my mother had decided wasn't good enough for me from the moment I'd introduced them 3 years ago. And I watched her look at him now with that particular expression of disdain she'd perfected, the one that said she was suffering through something beneath her. "We've been doing a lot of thinking," my mother continued, and my father nodded on cue, because that's what he always did, enabled her cruelty with his silence. "And we just don't think we can support you marrying someone with no real prospects." Brett's girlfriend Stephanie shifted uncomfortably in her chair but said nothing, and Brett himself just took another bite of the rosemary chicken my mother had spent all afternoon preparing. The golden child who'd never had to work for affection or approval or anything else in his life. The $40,000 my parents had promised for my wedding, the money they'd committed to 6 months ago when Jake proposed, was apparently being redirected to Brett for some vague cryptocurrency investment opportunity he'd mentioned exactly once at Christmas. My mother explained this as though it were perfectly reasonable, as though taking back a promise to your daughter to fund your son's latest scheme was just sound financial planning. And I felt Jake's fingers tighten around mine, his quiet, steady presence the only thing keeping me grounded. I didn't tell her what I should have that night, didn't mention that the consulting firm I'd built over the last 2 years was worth $2.3 million, or that I had an acquisition offer on the table for $3.5 million, or that I could buy and sell her precious country club membership twice over. I just sat there and absorbed it, the latest in a lifetime of being overlooked and undervalued and compared unfavorably to Brett, and I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. I would plan my own wedding, on my own terms, and my mother would see exactly what her circus really looked like. The pattern had been there my entire life, woven so tightly into the fabric of our family that I'd stopped questioning it somewhere around middle school and just accepted it as the way things were, the way they would always be. I graduated valedictorian from New Trier High School in 2013, 16 years old, and terrified to give my speech in front of 800 people. And my mother didn't attend the ceremony because Brett had a baseball game that afternoon, a regular season game for his freshman team where he sat on the bench for 7 innings, while my father cheered and my mother kept the scorebook. I found out later from my aunt that I'd given a good speech, that people had laughed at the right moments, and that several parents had commented on how poised I seemed. But I wouldn't know, because the two people whose opinion mattered most to me were sitting in aluminum bleachers 40 miles away, watching my brother warm the bench. College was supposed to be different, or at least that's what I told myself when I got my acceptance letter to Northwestern with a full academic scholarship, 4 years of tuition and room and board covered, because I'd spent high school with my nose in books while Brett partied and scraped by with C averages. My parents took me to dinner at the Cheesecake Factory to celebrate, and my mother spent most of the meal talking about how Brett was finding himself at the community college he'd enrolled in, how not everyone was built for traditional academics, how there were different kinds of intelligence. Brett dropped out that first semester, and again when he re-enrolled the following year, and my parents paid for him to spend 3 months in Europe, gaining life experience. A trip that cost them roughly $20,000 while I was eating ramen in my dorm room and working 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore to cover my expenses beyond what the scholarship provided. I graduated with a degree in marketing and communications in 2017, landed a junior position at a consulting firm in downtown Chicago, making $45,000 a year, and I worked 80-hour weeks to prove myself, while Brett bounced from one entry-level job to another, never staying anywhere longer than 6 months because the managers didn't understand him, or the work wasn't fulfilling, or whatever excuse he offered that week. 3 years later, when I'd worked my way up to senior consultant and was pulling in $90,000 a year, my parents gave Brett $80,000 as a down payment on a condo in Lincoln Park, and they gave me $500 for my 25th birthday with a card that said, "Invest wisely," like it was some grand gesture of financial mentorship. I met Jake 2 years after that at a charity fundraiser I'd helped organize for the consulting firm, a black tie event where I was managing logistics, and he was there because his school's principal had bought a table, and he made me laugh during the silent auction when he bid $200 on a weekend at a bed and breakfast, just so the elderly woman who donated it wouldn't feel bad that no one else was bidding. He taught English at a public high school on the South Side, made $52,000 a year, spent his summers developing curriculum and his own money on books for students whose families couldn't afford them, and he was the kindest man I'd ever met. But my mother took one look at him and asked me privately if this was really the best I could do. 2 years ago, while my mother was still making comments about Jake's profession and my father was nodding along in agreement, I started my own consulting firm with money I'd saved and a business loan I qualified for based on my track record, and I built it into something worth $2.3 million through contracts with mid-sized companies who needed marketing strategy but couldn't afford the big firms. The acquisition offer came through 6 months after Jake proposed, a major Chicago consulting corporation that wanted to absorb my client list and my methodology, and they were offering $3.5 million, and I hadn't told my parents any of it because I'd learned long ago that my achievements only mattered to them if they came with the right optics. And a daughter who was more successful than their son didn't fit the narrative they'd constructed. Jake proposed 6 months before that devastating dinner at my parents' house, on a Saturday afternoon in September, when the Chicago Botanical Gardens were still holding on to the last warmth of summer, and the dahlias were blooming in impossible colors that reminded me of the paintings he'd shown me from his classroom, the ones his sophomore students had done when he'd taught them about imagery and poetry. He'd planned it simply and perfectly. A picnic by the Japanese garden where we'd had our third date 2.5 years earlier, and when he got down on one knee with a ring he'd clearly spent months saving for, I felt something I'd never felt with my family, a sense of being chosen deliberately and completely for exactly who I was. I called my parents from the parking lot with Jake's hand warm in mine and my heart still racing. And my mother's first question after I'd breathlessly announced my engagement wasn't congratulations or expressions of joy, but "How big is the ring?" with that particular tone that said she was already calculating whether it met her standards. The ring was a half-carat diamond in a white gold setting, modest but beautifully chosen, and Jake had paid $2,000 for it, which I knew represented a significant portion of his savings on a high school teacher's salary of $52,000 a year. My mother's response after I'd told her the specs, because of course she'd asked for specifics, was, "Well, I suppose it's appropriate for a teacher's salary," and I could hear the disappointment dripping through the phone line, the comparison she was already making to Brett's girlfriend, Stephanie's 2-carat ring that my parents had helped pay $15,000 for when Brett proposed 3 months earlier. Wedding planning started immediately because my mother took over before I'd even had a chance to catch my breath. And what I'd envisioned as an intimate ceremony with 100 guests who actually mattered to us became a production of 250 people, most of whom were my mother's friends and my parents' business associates and people I hadn't seen since high school. I wanted the small garden venue I'd found in Evanston, a historic property with a greenhouse and natural landscaping that cost $8,000 and felt like the kind of place where Jake and I could actually be ourselves. But my mother insisted on her country club in Wilmette, the one where she played tennis twice a week and hosted her book club, a venue that cost $35,000 and came with a list of requirements about approved caterers and mandatory bar packages and decorating restrictions that made my head spin. She promised to pay for it as her contribution to the wedding, which should have felt generous, except that every decision became hers. Every choice filtered through what would look good to her friends, and what would photograph well, and what would make the right impression. And I found myself nodding along while Jake squeezed my hand under tables at planning meetings, and gave me looks that said he'd marry me in a parking lot if that's what I wanted. I had a secret plan forming even then, months before the cancellation, which was that I'd quietly pay for the wedding myself and let my mother think she was contributing. Let her have her moment of control, because I'd learned that sometimes it was easier to let her believe she'd won than to fight battles that would leave everyone exhausted. And Jake didn't know the full extent of my business success yet, because I'd kept it quiet the way I'd kept so many achievements quiet over the years, afraid of being valued for what I had instead of who I was. Jake's family was everything my family wasn't: warm and welcoming, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. His parents asking questions about my work and my dreams and my childhood with real curiosity, instead of the performative interest my mother showed when other people were watching. They were solidly middle class, his father a retired electrician, and his mother a part-time bookkeeper, and they lived in a modest ranch house in Oak Park that felt more like home after 3 visits than my parents' showplace in Wilmette had felt in 28 years. But my mother made constant comparisons between the families, little comments about how different Jake's background was and how interesting it would be to blend our very different worlds. And I felt my breaking point approaching with every dismissive remark, and every time my father nodded along in agreement. But I kept trying to keep the peace, because that's what I'd always done: swallowed my hurt and my anger and my bone-deep exhaustion at never being enough. The dinner happened 3 months before the wedding on a Thursday evening in March, when the last remnants of winter were still clinging to Chicago, and the drive to my parents' house in Wilmette felt longer than usual, because I knew something was wrong from the tone of my mother's voice when she'd called to invite us, that particular brightness that meant she was planning something, and I wasn't going to like it. Brett and Stephanie were already there when Jake and I arrived, sitting in the formal living room with drinks that my father had poured, and my mother kissed my cheek with her usual perfunctory affection before ushering us to the dining room where she'd set the table with her wedding china, which should have been my first real warning, because she only used the wedding china when she wanted to remind someone of something important, or when she was making a point about propriety and tradition. We made it through the first course of butternut squash soup before my mother cleared her throat in that deliberate way she had and said, "Your father and I have been discussing the wedding, and we've made a decision." And I felt Jake's hand find mine under the table, even before she continued with, "We've decided we're not funding this circus anymore." And the word circus landed like a slap, sharp and stinging, and calculated to wound. My father nodded along immediately, his agreement automatic after 32 years of marriage, and said, "Your mother's right, sweetheart," in that placating tone that made it clear he'd already abdicated any real decision-making to her. And Brett took a long drink of his wine and said nothing, offered no defense, just watched with something that looked uncomfortably close to satisfaction. My mother's justification came in a rush of words about fiscal responsibility and long-term planning, and how she and my father couldn't in good conscience support me marrying someone with no prospects. And she looked directly at Jake when she said prospects like he was a failed investment rather than the man I loved. And then she delivered the real blow by announcing they were giving the $40,000 they'd promised for my wedding to Brett instead for his investment opportunity, which turned out to be some vague cryptocurrency scheme that Brett's friend from college was running, and that would lose most of the money within 6 months, though none of us knew that yet. I asked quietly, my voice somehow steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs, "What about everything you already committed to? The deposits, the contracts?" And my mother waved her hand dismissively and said they'd pay the cancellation fees. Approximately $8,000 in deposits already given to the country club and the caterer and the florist. But that was it, nothing more. And then she leaned forward with false concern in her eyes and said, "Maybe this is a sign you should reconsider the whole thing." And I understood in that moment that she wasn't just withdrawing money, she was withdrawing approval, withdrawing support, withdrawing whatever threadbare version of maternal love she'd been offering all these years. Jake and I left quietly 20 minutes later, declining dessert and coffee, and in the car driving back to our apartment in Lincoln Park, he offered to elope, said he'd marry me at the courthouse tomorrow if I wanted, that he didn't need a big wedding or any wedding at all, he just needed me. And I loved him so desperately in that moment that I had to look out the window so he wouldn't see me crying. But something crystallized in me during that drive home through the dark Chicago streets, something hard and bright and final, which was that I was done protecting my parents from the consequences of their choices, done making myself smaller to fit their narrative, done hoping that somehow they'd finally see me for who I actually was. And I decided right then that I would plan my own wedding, my way, on my terms, with my own money that they knew nothing about. And I wouldn't tell them about the business success, or the acquisition deal, or any of it yet, because the right moment would come. And when it did, they would finally understand exactly what they'd been dismissing all these years. 2 weeks after that devastating dinner, I told Jake the full truth about my business success. Sitting at our kitchen table in the Lincoln Park apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee getting cold between us and sunlight streaming through the windows, and I walked him through everything I'd been keeping quiet for the past 2 years. The consulting firm I'd built from nothing into a thriving business worth $2.3 million. The clients I'd landed through 80-hour work weeks and relentless networking and refusing to accept that being young and female meant I couldn't compete with the established firms, and most importantly, the acquisition offer that had come through 3 months before he'd proposed. A major consulting corporation wanting to buy my client list and my proprietary marketing systems and my reputation for $3.5 million. Jake's reaction wasn't what I'd feared during all those months of keeping silent. No intimidation or resentment or wounded male pride. Just pure, unfiltered pride in what I'd accomplished. And then the question I should have anticipated, but somehow didn't, which was why I'd kept it secret from him. And I gave him the honest answer, which was that I'd been afraid of being valued only for money, the way my parents valued everything. Afraid that any relationship I had would be colored by what I could provide, rather than who I actually was. He took my hands across the table and told me he loved me for the woman who volunteered at the literacy center where he sent struggling students, for the person who remembered his students' names and asked about their progress, for the partner who understood his passion for teaching, even though it would never make him wealthy. And that money changed nothing about how he saw me, except to make him even more impressed by what I'd quietly achieved, while my family dismissed everything I did. We planned the wedding together that afternoon, spreading my laptop and notebooks across the table, and set a budget of $50,000 of my own money, which felt simultaneously extravagant and perfectly reasonable given what I could actually afford. And the first thing we did was book the original garden venue I'd wanted in Evanston. The historic property with the greenhouse and the natural landscaping that cost $8,000 and would give us space for 80 guests who actually mattered to us, instead of the 250 strangers my mother had been planning to impress. I sent formal invitations to my parents and Brett anyway, because I wanted them there despite everything, wanted to give them one more chance to show up for me, even if I wasn't expecting them to actually see what they were being shown. And my mother called 3 days after receiving her invitation with that particular tone in her voice that meant she was being magnanimous about my obvious failures, and said, "Well, I suppose a backyard wedding suits your budget." Assuming that the small guest list and the venue change meant Jake and I were scraping together whatever we could afford on our modest combined salaries. I didn't correct her, just said simply, "We're happy with our choices." And she condescendingly offered to attend anyway, to save you embarrassment, as if her presence was some kind of gift rather than exactly what I'd invited her for. And when she RSVP'd yes with a note that said, "Someone needs to be there to explain to people," I showed it to Jake, and we both laughed because we knew exactly what was coming, even if she didn't. Brett and Stephanie RSVP'd yes without commentary, and my plan was forming in crystalline detail, which was simply to let the wedding speak for itself and let my parents finally confront the reality of who I actually was versus who they'd decided I must be. And I wouldn't announce my success, or wave it in their faces, or make any grand revelations. I would just stop hiding. The acquisition deal was progressing smoothly toward closing, contracts being reviewed by my best friend Rachel, who was a corporate lawyer and had helped negotiate the terms, and she'd been encouraging me for months to stop hiding my success from everyone, including my family, arguing that my silence was protecting people who didn't deserve protection. But I told her the right moment would come. Rachel became my maid of honor, my ally in all of this. The friend who'd seen me build my business from the ground up and who understood exactly what my family's dismissal had cost me emotionally over the years. And she promised that whatever happened at the wedding, she'd be right there beside me. The invitations we sent out were printed on heavy cardstock that cost $8 per invitation. Elegant and understated but unmistakably expensive to anyone who knew anything about wedding stationery, subtle hints of the reality my mother was about to encounter. But she didn't notice the quality, because she'd already decided what this wedding would be, and nothing was going to shake that certainty until she was standing in the middle of the evidence. 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother started calling every Tuesday and Thursday with what she called advice about cutting costs. And her first suggestion was that I buy my wedding dress at a consignment shop in Evanston that she'd read about in some local magazine, telling me they had designer gowns for a fraction of retail and that no one would know the difference. But what she really meant was that no one would know I couldn't afford new, and I listened to her 20-minute explanation of how smart brides shopped secondhand while looking at the receipt on my desk for the custom dress I'd already ordered. $8,000 for a gown that was being fitted to my exact measurements by a designer whose work had been featured in Vogue. She even offered me her own wedding dress from 1986, saying, "I kept it all these years, and since you can't afford new, it would be something borrowed and something old at the same time." And I politely declined and told her I'd already found something, and she asked where, and I said just a boutique downtown, keeping it vague because I knew any details would lead to lectures about fiscal irresponsibility that I didn't have the energy to endure. Her comments about Jake continued with that same condescending concern she'd perfected over the years. Little observations like, "At least he has health insurance through teaching, that's something," and, "You'll need to budget carefully on those salaries. Maybe I should send you some articles about meal planning." And I bit my tongue so hard during those calls that I started keeping a glass of water nearby just to have something to do with my mouth, besides say what I was actually thinking. Jake's parents called us in early May and offered to contribute $5,000 to the wedding, saying they knew we were doing this without my parents' help, and they wanted to support us however they could, and the difference between their genuine generosity and my mother's conditional control was so stark, it actually made me cry. And Jake and I accepted their gift graciously, and used it to upgrade our honeymoon, adding an extra week in Tuscany to the trip I'd already booked and paid for, $12,000 total for 2 weeks in Italy, staying at hotels that Jake kept calling too expensive until I reminded him we could afford it. Brett called out of nowhere asking to be best man, the first time he'd reached out to me in months about anything other than borrowing money or asking if I knew anyone hiring, and I told him I'd already asked Rachel to be my maid of honor and that Jake had chosen his college roommate as his best man. And Brett got quiet in that particular way that meant his feelings were hurt, but he'd never actually say so. And I stood firm because I wasn't going to rearrange my wedding party for someone who'd never stood up for me once. The acquisition deal finalized on May 15th with a signing ceremony at the purchasing corporation's downtown Chicago office, champagne and congratulations, and a check that made my financial advisor actually whistle when I showed him the deposit slip, and I was now officially wealthy by any reasonable standard, $3.5 million minus taxes, and Rachel's legal fees, still leaving me with just over $2 million in liquid assets. A local business journal requested an interview about the acquisition, and I scheduled it for the week after the wedding because I wanted that day to be about marrying Jake, not about business achievement, though in my mind the two were connected because Jake was the first person who'd ever loved me without needing me to prove I deserved it. My former boss at the consulting firm threw an engagement party at a upscale venue in River North, and I invited my parents out of obligation, and they declined, saying they were too busy, which was probably for the best because the party was attended by Chicago business elite, CEOs and entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who gave us gifts like wine collections and stock portfolios and checks with multiple zeros, and Rachel gave a toast that hinted at my success without stating it outright, saying I was one of the smartest businesswomen she knew and that my family would be amazed if they bothered to pay attention. Word was starting to spread in professional circles about the acquisition and about my plans to start a venture capital firm, and I did 3 networking meetings that month where people congratulated me and asked about my investment thesis. But my mother didn't travel in these circles and didn't read the business section and remained completely unaware that her daughter, who was marrying beneath herself, was actually wealthier than anyone in our extended family. 7 days before the wedding, my mother called with what she announced was her final plea for me to reconsider marrying Jake, her voice carrying that particular mix of concern and condescension she'd perfected over the years. And she said, "Emily, honey, it's not too late to call it off, you know." As if canceling a wedding a week beforehand was a reasonable suggestion rather than an insane proposition. And when I asked her why on earth I would do that, she sighed heavily and said, "You could do so much better, sweetheart. You're settling and you're going to regret it." And I felt something settle in my chest, a calm certainty that replaced the hurt I might have felt 6 months earlier. And I told her, I've never been more sure of anything in my life, with such firmness that she actually went quiet for a moment before huffing, "Well, don't come crying to me when you're struggling to make ends meet on a teacher's salary." And I said simply, "I won't," and ended the call before she could say anything else. My final dress fitting was that afternoon, and Rachel accompanied me to the boutique in River North where my custom gown had been created. And while the seamstress made microscopic adjustments to the already perfect fit, Rachel asked quietly if I was going to tell my parents about the acquisition before the wedding, and I told her, "They'll see soon enough," because I'd decided that announcing it would seem like I was trying to prove something, when the truth was, I had nothing left to prove, not to them and not to anyone. The rehearsal dinner was planned for the night before the wedding, and Jake's parents were hosting it at a nice Italian restaurant in Evanston, a family-owned place that Jake's father had been going to for 30 years, and they'd budgeted $3,000 for the event, which was generous and thoughtful and completely from the heart. And my parents arrived 20 minutes late with my mother criticizing the venue immediately, saying, "A bit fancy for the budget, isn't it?" to Jake's mother, who just smiled graciously and ignored the barb like she'd been ignoring them all evening. My mother made comments throughout dinner about the modest wedding happening tomorrow, comparing it repeatedly to Brett and Stephanie's upcoming engagement party, and I learned during the salad course that Brett and Stephanie were planning their wedding for next year, and that my mother had already promised them a $60,000 budget, $20,000 more than she'd originally promised me, and the favoritism was so blatant that even Stephanie looked uncomfortable when my mother mentioned it. I overheard my mother telling Jake's parents during the main course that we offered to help Emily, of course, but she insisted on doing everything herself. You know how independent she is. Which was such a complete rewriting of history that I actually had to set down my wine glass to keep from saying something. But Emily caught my eye across the table and squeezed my hand under the tablecloth, support without words. And I let the lie stand, because tomorrow would correct every assumption my mother had made. The toasts at the end of dinner revealed everything about our two families, with Jake's father giving an emotional speech about how happy he was to be gaining a daughter, and how he'd watched Jake fall in love with someone who matched his kindness and his values, while my father gave a brief, awkward toast about wishing us well, and my mother didn't toast at all, just sat there with her wine glass untouched and her mouth set in a tight line. I realized as we were leaving the restaurant that tomorrow would be the revelation I'd been unconsciously building toward for months, and I felt nervous but ready. And when Jake dropped me at the hotel where I'd be spending the night according to the tradition about the groom not seeing the bride, Rachel stayed with me, her supportive presence exactly what I needed as I stood on the edge of everything changing. The wedding day arrived with perfect June weather, the kind of morning that felt like a gift with clear skies and gentle warmth that promised a beautiful afternoon. And I woke up in the bridal suite at the Peninsula Hotel at 6:30, even though I'd set my alarm for 7 because my mind was already racing with anticipation and nerves and the surreal reality that I was getting married today. The suite had cost $800 for the night, a detail I knew my mother would find horrifying if she understood I'd paid for it myself, and Rachel arrived at 7 with coffee and bagels and that calm, supportive energy she'd been radiating for months, followed shortly by my 3 college friends and Jake's sister who made up the rest of my bridal party. And by 8, the professional hair and makeup team I'd hired for $2,000 had transformed the suite into an organized chaos of curling irons and makeup brushes and champagne that someone had ordered from room service. My mother arrived at 8:30, surveying the suite with those sharp, assessing eyes that took in every detail. The plush robes we were all wearing, the elaborate spread of breakfast pastries, the professional lighting setup the makeup artist had brought, and her first comment was, "This must be costing a fortune," with that particular tone that mixed concern with judgment, and I told her calmly, "It's handled, Mom," without elaborating, because I'd learned that less information meant fewer criticisms. I could see her doing calculations in her head, probably assuming the hotel had given us some kind of discount or that Jake's parents had dipped into their retirement savings. And when my dress was finally revealed, brought out from its garment bag by the boutique assistant who'd delivered it that morning, my mother's eyes actually widened because even someone with her determination to find fault couldn't deny that the custom Vera Wang gown was absolutely stunning, elegant and sophisticated with delicate lace details and a silhouette that had been tailored exactly to my body. She asked, "How much did this cost?" with something like alarm in her voice, and I simply said, "It's exactly what I wanted," because the $8,000 price tag was none of her business, and she muttered something about irresponsible spending that I pretended not to hear while the photographer I'd hired, one of Chicago's top wedding photographers whose $6,000 fee had been worth every penny, captured everything, including my mother's tight, disapproving expression. When she noticed his high-end equipment, the multiple camera bodies and professional lighting setup, she asked, "Aren't you worried about going into debt for all this?" And I gave her my calmest smile and said, "Everything's paid for, Mom," which only seemed to confuse her more, and she said, "Jake's parents must have spent their retirement fund," with such certainty that Rachel actually laughed and interjected, "Emily paid for it before I could stop her." My mother's laugh was sharp and disbelieving as she said, "On a consultant's salary? She must have maxed out credit cards." And I watched Rachel start to correct her, to explain about the acquisition and the millions of dollars now sitting in my bank account. But I caught her eye and shook my head slightly, mouthing, "Let it be," because I wanted my mother to see everything first, to make all her assumptions and judgments before reality corrected her. The limousine arrived at 10 to transport the bridal party to the venue, an upgraded luxury vehicle I'd booked for $1,200 that had my mother's confusion growing, even as she still assumed we were drowning in debt. And during the 30-minute ride to the garden estate outside Chicago, I watched her face as we pulled up to the venue, a stunning historic property with manicured gardens and a stone mansion that served as the backdrop for ceremonies. The kind of place that cost significantly more than the $8,000 venue I'd originally wanted before my mother had taken over my wedding planning. The 80 guests were already arriving, a carefully curated mix of both families and genuine friends, and I noticed my professional colleagues among them, the CEOs and executives and entrepreneurs I'd worked with over the past 2 years, though my mother didn't recognize the significance of their presence yet because she didn't travel in those circles. The venue had been decorated exactly as I'd envisioned, with thousands of flowers creating an almost ethereal garden atmosphere. A string quartet playing classical music, and set up so perfect it looked like something from a magazine, and my mother pulled me aside with growing concern on her face and asked, "Emily, what did all this cost?" And I told her gently, "Don't worry about it, Mom," because worrying was her choice, not my responsibility. But she pressed with, "You'll be paying this off for years." And all I could think was that in a few hours, she'd understand exactly how wrong she was about everything. The ceremony began at exactly 2 o'clock with the string quartet playing Pachelbel's Canon as our 80 carefully chosen guests settled into their white chairs, arranged in semicircular rows, facing the flower-draped arbor where Jake was waiting. And I could see from my position at the back of the garden that he had tears in his eyes already, and the professional videographer I'd hired was capturing everything with the kind of equipment that cost more than some people's cars. And I had chosen to walk down the aisle alone, a deliberate symbolic choice about my independence that I knew my mother wouldn't understand, but that felt absolutely right to me. The ceremony was being officiated by Judge Patricia Morrison, a federal judge I'd met through my business networking and who had become a genuine friend over the past year. And I could see my mother sitting in the front row with her mouth set in that tight line that meant she was struggling to process everything she was seeing, while Brett and Stephanie were whispering to each other with expressions that mixed shock with something that might have been respect. The vows we exchanged were personal and emotional and completely genuine, with Jake's voice breaking slightly as he said, "I promise to support your dreams and celebrate your strength, to stand beside you as an equal partner, never threatened by your success, but proud of everything you achieve." And my own vows referenced his unwavering support and acceptance. The way he'd loved me before he knew about the money, and would love me the same way regardless of what I had or didn't have, and there was no mention of wealth or business success, because none of that mattered in this moment, just the love and partnership we were committing to. When we exchanged rings, I slid onto his finger the platinum band I'd chosen, a $3,000 piece that he didn't know I'd upgraded from the simpler version we'd originally selected, and he gave me the antique ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a delicate gold band with tiny sapphires that had far more sentimental value than monetary worth. And the contrast between our approaches to meaningful gifts said everything about our different values and why we worked so well together. Judge Morrison pronounced us married, and we kissed as our guests applauded, and I caught a glimpse of my mother's face as we walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, still confused and concerned about how all of this was being paid for, still operating under her assumption that we were drowning in debt for this one perfect day. The cocktail hour began immediately on the garden terrace, where staff in crisp uniforms circulated with trays of past hors d'oeuvres, shrimp cocktail and beef tenderloin crostini and delicate vegetable tarts, while guests helped themselves to the top-shelf open bar I'd specifically requested, and there was even an ice sculpture of intertwined hearts that I knew cost a ridiculous amount, but had wanted anyway. And a live jazz trio played sophisticated standards that created exactly the elegant atmosphere I'd envisioned. I was accepting congratulations from my colleagues when I heard one of the CEOs I'd worked with say loudly, "Emily, congratulations on everything. I can't wait to see what you do with the acquisition money." And I watched my mother's head snap around from where she'd been standing about 10 feet away, her face showing clear confusion as another guest responded, "3.5 million, right? That's an incredible achievement for someone so young." And I saw the exact moment when my mother's face drained of all color as understanding began to dawn. She approached me with quick, determined steps, her voice tight as she asked, "Emily, what are they talking about?" And I met her eyes calmly and said, "My business, Mom. I sold my consulting firm." And she asked, "For how much?" with something like dread in her voice, and I told her simply, $3.5 million. The deal closed 2 weeks ago. And I watched her become completely speechless, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out, while behind her Brett had clearly overheard because his jaw had literally dropped open in an almost comical expression of shock. The guests began moving from the garden terrace toward the reception tent that had been erected on the estate's south lawn, an elegant white structure with crystal chandeliers suspended from the ceiling and sides that could be rolled up to let in the perfect June evening air. And as Jake and I made our entrance as husband and wife to enthusiastic applause, I saw my mother and Brett sitting at the family table looking absolutely stunned, their faces still processing the revelation about my business sale. While around them, our guests celebrated without any awareness of the family drama that had just unfolded. The tables were set with fine china and elaborate centerpieces of peonies and roses that had cost more than I wanted to calculate, and the menu I'd selected was a four-course plated dinner with premium catering that ran $180 per plate, the kind of meal that made a statement about the level of celebration this was. And our first dance took place on the professional dance floor I'd had installed with theatrical lighting designed to create the perfect romantic atmosphere, while our guests watched and took photos and videos that I knew would be beautiful. I could see one of my mother's friends from her social circle lean over and say something to her, probably a comment about how lovely everything was, or asking if she was proud. And my mother forced a smile and nodded, though I knew she was dying inside because she couldn't admit that she'd had no idea about any of my success, couldn't acknowledge that she'd been completely wrong about everything. The dinner service began with a butternut squash soup, followed by arugula salad with candied pecans, and then my former boss, David Chen, stood to give a toast that made my mother's face grow progressively tighter as he detailed my professional achievements, referring to me as one of Chicago's rising business stars, and describing my company's growth from a startup operating out of my apartment to a multi-million-dollar firm that had attracted acquisition interest from 3 separate corporations before I'd accepted the best offer. Rachel's toast came next, emotional and pointed as she talked about my strength and resilience and determination, and while she didn't explicitly criticize my parents, her words about how I'd succeeded despite lack of family support and without the validation she deserved made the subtext absolutely clear to everyone listening. And I watched several guests glance toward my parents' table with expressions that ranged from curious to disapproving. Jake's best man Marcus, his college roommate who'd become a close friend to both of us, gave a toast that was funny and loving and included a story about the first time Jake had told him about me, how Jake had said, "I met someone who's going to change my life," and how right he'd been, and Marcus finished by saying, "Jake has always been proud of Emily's success, but what he's most proud of is her character, her kindness, and her strength," which felt like another subtle dig at my parents, though Marcus probably didn't intend it that way. I heard my father lean toward my mother and whisper, "Did you know about any of this?" And my mother hissed back, "Of course," which was such an obvious lie that I almost felt sorry for her, while Brett sat looking deflated and Stephanie seemed genuinely impressed as she watched the toasts and the celebration unfold. The cake cutting came next, a custom 5-tier creation that had cost $2,500 and was almost too beautiful to cut into. And as Jake and I posed for photos with the cake, I caught my mother's eye across the room, and I made sure my expression showed no triumph, no satisfaction at her shock, just calm acceptance of who I was and what I'd achieved. The 8-piece band I'd hired for $4,000 started playing for dancing, everything from Frank Sinatra standards to current pop hits, and I was dancing with Jake when my mother approached us on the dance floor with that determined expression that meant she wanted to talk, and she said, "Emily, we need to talk," with urgency in her voice. But I simply said, "Not now, Mom. It's my wedding," because I wasn't going to let her make this moment about her feelings and her shock and her need to process what she'd learned. She pressed anyway, asking, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I looked at her directly and asked, "Would it have mattered?" And watched her face as she tried to formulate an answer that wouldn't condemn her. My mother insisted on pulling me aside despite my clear statement that we would talk later, her hand gripping my arm with the kind of determination that had always gotten her what she wanted. And I allowed myself to be led away from the dance floor to a quiet corner of the garden where the music was muffled and the hanging lights created pools of shadow, and Rachel immediately followed at a discreet distance, close enough to provide support, but far enough to give us space, and my mother's opening words were sharp with accusation as she said, "I can't believe you kept this from us." And I met her eyes calmly and responded, "I kept it from you because this is exactly how you'd react." And she demanded, "What does that mean?" with genuine confusion in her voice, as if she couldn't see her own patterns. And I said quietly but firmly, "You only care now because there's money involved." And she became defensive immediately, saying, "That's not fair." But I pressed forward because I had spent 28 years biting my tongue, and tonight was the night for truth. And I asked, "Isn't it? You called my wedding a circus. You withdrew your support. You've spent years telling me I'm not good enough." And my mother's face flushed as she insisted, "We never said that." But I shook my head and told her, "You've said it 1,000 ways without using those words." And the examples poured out of me then, all the accumulated hurts I'd been carrying, the graduation ceremony she'd skipped, the scholarship she'd dismissed, the birthday where Brett got $80,000 and I got 500, every single moment when I'd been overlooked and diminished and made to feel like my achievements didn't matter. My mother attempted to justify it all by saying Brett needed more support, as if that explained everything. But I responded, Brett needed accountability. I needed recognition. And she tried again with, "We always loved you equally," which was perhaps the most painful lie because I said, "Love isn't just a word, Mom, it's actions, and your actions showed me exactly where I stood." And that's when my father approached, having clearly followed us from the reception, and he said, "Emily, your mother just wants what's best for you," in that placating tone he'd always used to smooth things over without actually addressing anything. And I turned to him and said, "No, Dad, she wants what looks best to her friends," which made my mother's eyes fill with tears as she asked, "How can you say that?" And I answered, "Because you told me not to marry Jake. You called him beneath me. You canceled your support to humiliate me." And my mother insisted, "We were trying to protect you." But I challenged that by asking, "From what? From someone who loves me unconditionally? Who supports my dreams? Who never made me feel small?" And that's when Jake appeared, having noticed my absence from the reception. And he came to stand beside me with his hand on my back in that gesture of support that meant everything. And my mother looked at him and said, "I suppose you're very happy now," with bitterness in her voice. But Jake's response was calm and dignified as he said, "I was happy when she agreed to marry me. The money changes nothing for me." And my mother actually scoffed and said, "Everyone says that," which prompted me to tell her, "That's the difference between you and Jake, Mom. You can't imagine loving someone for who they are, not what they have." And then Brett and Stephanie wandered over, having apparently noticed the family drama unfolding. And Brett said, I think you're being harsh," which was such typical Brett behavior that I actually rounded on him and demanded, "When have you ever defended me?" Brett was taken aback by my direct challenge, his face showing genuine surprise that I would confront him so openly, and I pressed forward because I had started this truth-telling, and I wasn't going to stop now, and I said, "Tell me one time you stood up for me with Mom and Dad." And he stood there silent, unable to come up with a single example because there wasn't one, and I continued, "You've coasted your whole life on their favoritism. You dropped out of school twice. I paid my own way through Northwestern on a full scholarship I earned." And Brett tried to defend himself by saying, "That was your choice," as if my hard work had been some kind of preference rather than necessity, and I shook my head and said, "It was necessity. They gave you $80,000 for a condo down payment. They gave me $500 for my 25th birthday." And I saw Stephanie's face change as she heard these numbers. Clearly, she hadn't known the full extent of the disparity in how we'd been treated, and I kept going because all of it needed to be said, telling them, "They gave you $40,000 that was supposed to be for my wedding, money they'd promised me, and they gave it to you for cryptocurrency." And my father stepped forward and said, "Now that's private family business," with that tone that meant I was being inappropriate by bringing it up. But I responded, You made it my business when you took my wedding money. And my mother tried a different approach by saying, we would have helped if you'd told us you were successful, as if my net worth was the determining factor in whether I deserved their support. And I asked quietly, would you? Or would you have asked for loans for Brett? And the silence that followed answered my question more clearly than words could have. And I said, I built a multi-million-dollar company. I did it while you told me I wasn't ambitious enough, while you criticized every choice I made, while you acted like my achievements were somehow less important than Brett's mere existence. And my mother insisted, we didn't know. But I countered with, you didn't ask, you never asked about my work, you never asked about my dreams, you talked at me, not to me. And that's when Rachel stepped forward and said, Emily has been fundraising for women's business initiatives. She's donated over $100,000 to help other women entrepreneurs. And my mother's eyes widened at this information, and Rachel continued, she's been profiled in 3 business magazines. She won Chicago's Young Entrepreneur Award last year. There was a whole ceremony. And I added softly, you didn't notice because you weren't looking. And my father said, we would have been proud, in this wounded tone, as if I was being unfair. But I told him, I needed you to be proud before the money, before the success, when I was just your daughter trying her best. And my mother was crying now as she said, we were proud. But I shook my head and said, you never showed me. And Jake, who had been standing quietly beside me, touched my arm and said, Emily, we should get back to our guests. And I nodded, grateful for the interruption because I could feel myself starting to shake with emotion, and I turned to my parents and said, I want you to stay, enjoy the wedding, but understand this is who I am, with or without your approval. And I started to walk away, but my mother called, Emily, wait. And I paused and turned back, and she said, I'm sorry. And those 2 words were the first real apology I could remember ever receiving from her. And I felt something shift in my chest as I responded, thank you, but sorry isn't enough anymore. I need you to change. Emily and Jake returned to the reception, and I took a moment to steady my breathing while Jake's hand stayed firmly in mine, grounding me in the present moment. And the guests hadn't noticed the family drama that had unfolded in the garden corner because the band was playing and people were dancing and laughing and celebrating. And I realized that this was what mattered. These people who had shown up for us, who genuinely cared, and Jake leaned close and asked, you okay? With such concern in his voice, and I looked at him and said, I am. Actually, I really am, and meant it completely because something had shifted inside me during that confrontation. A weight I'd been carrying for 28 years had lifted from my shoulders, and I understood that I had said everything I needed to say, and now whatever happened with my parents was their choice to make. The dancing resumed, and Jake's father approached and asked if he could have this dance, and I accepted gratefully, and as we moved across the floor he said simply, you're good for him, he's good for you, without any of the complications or conditions my own parents attached to everything, just straightforward acceptance of who I was and what we had together. And I felt tears prick my eyes at this simple statement, because it was exactly what I'd never gotten from my own father. Throughout the evening, my colleagues approached to congratulate me, and several conversations turned to business and future plans. And I found myself talking about something I'd been considering for weeks, revealing that I was planning to start a venture capital firm focused on funding women-owned businesses, that I wanted to use the acquisition money to help other women like me, who had great ideas and strong work ethics, but faced barriers to funding. And the response was immediately enthusiastic, with several people offering to connect me with potential clients and partners. My mother and father remained at their table looking subdued, my mother's face showing the tear tracks from our conversation, and I saw Brett and Stephanie on the dance floor, Brett's expression thoughtful in a way I'd rarely seen, and later he approached me and asked, can we talk? And we stepped aside from the crowd. And Brett said, I never realized how different it was for you, with what seemed like genuine surprise, and I responded, because you never had to think about it, without anger now, just stating fact, and Brett said, I'm sorry, I should have been a better brother. And these words were the first genuine moment we'd shared in years, maybe ever, and I told him, "You still can be," because I meant it. The door wasn't closed if he was willing to walk through it differently. And Brett nodded and said, "I'd like that." And then Stephanie joined us and said, "Your wedding is beautiful, you should be proud." And I smiled and said, "I am, for the first time in a long time, I'm proud of myself." And realized how true that was. Later, my mother approached alone while I was standing with Rachel, and she asked quietly, "May I have this dance?" And I hesitated because I was emotionally exhausted, but then agreed because refusing would have been petty. And we moved to the dance floor and swayed in silence for a moment before my mother said, "I've been a terrible mother to you." And I shook my head and said, "Not terrible, just absent in the ways I needed you," because that was more accurate. And she asked, "I don't know how to fix this," with helplessness in her voice. And I told her, "Start by seeing me, really seeing me, not who you want me to be, but who I am." And she nodded with tears falling down her cheeks and said, "I'm so sorry I missed it all." And I responded, "You haven't missed it all, but you'll miss the future if you don't change." Because that was the truth. The door was open, but only if she was willing to walk through it differently. The dance ended, and my mother kissed my cheek and said, "Congratulations, sweetheart, you've built an incredible life." And I said, "I have, and I want you in it, but on my terms now." And she nodded in understanding and walked back to where my father sat watching us. The reception was winding down as evening settled over the garden estate, and the June sky had turned to deep purple streaked with orange. And I realized that in just a few minutes, Jake and I would be leaving for our honeymoon, and this perfect day would transition into the next chapter of our lives. And we had planned a sparkler exit with our photographer positioned to capture the moment as we walked through a tunnel of light created by our guests. I went to change into my departure outfit, a designer cocktail dress in champagne silk that I'd chosen specifically for this moment. And Rachel came with me to the bridal suite to help with the zipper and to share these last few minutes before Jake and I left. And as she fastened the tiny buttons at the back of the dress, she said, "You did it. You actually did it," with such pride in her voice. And I looked at her reflection in the mirror and asked, "Did what?" Even though I knew what she meant. And Rachel said, "Stood up for yourself, set boundaries, and didn't apologize for any of it." And I smiled because she was right. For the first time in my life, I had spoken my truth to my parents without hedging or softening or trying to make them feel better about their own behavior, and I told her, "Feels good," and meant it completely. Rachel's expression grew more serious as she said, "Your mom's been watching you all night." And I nodded because I had noticed my mother's eyes following me around the reception, her face showing an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and contemplation. And I said, "I noticed," and Rachel asked, "Think she'll change?" And I considered the question carefully before answering, "I don't know, but I know I've changed, and that's what matters." Because I had finally understood that I couldn't control my mother's choices or responses. I could only control my own boundaries and expectations. We returned to the reception for the final traditions, and I tossed my bouquet to a group of laughing single women, and my college friend Sarah caught it with a whoop of triumph. And then Jake removed the garter and tossed it to his cousin Mark, who turned bright red as everyone applauded. And then the DJ announced our final dance as a married couple before we departed, and Jake and I moved to the center of the floor while our guests formed a circle around us, watching and smiling. Jake pulled me close and said, "Best day of my life," with such sincerity that I felt tears prick my eyes again. And I responded, "Mine too," and he asked, "Even with the family drama?" with a slight smile, and I told him, "Especially with it, I needed to say those things." And he said, "I'm proud of you." And I asked, "For the business?" wondering if the money had changed how he saw me, despite his earlier assurances. But Jake shook his head and said, "For everything, but mostly for knowing your worth." And those words meant more to me than any compliment about my professional success could have. And we kissed, as our guests applauded, and the moment felt absolutely perfect. The guests began lining up outside with their sparklers ready, and Jake and I made our way through the reception saying goodbye to people, accepting final hugs and congratulations. And my father approached looking uncomfortable but determined and said, "Have a wonderful honeymoon," and then handed me a small envelope before walking away quickly. And I slipped it into my purse to look at later because guests were waiting. The sparkler exit was magical with golden light surrounding us as we walked hand in hand toward the waiting limousine. And in the car, finally alone together, Jake asked about the envelope my father had given me. And I opened it to find a check for $40,000 with a note in my father's handwriting that read, "Should have given you this before. We were wrong." And I stared at it for a long moment, feeling a complicated mix of emotions, and I showed it to Jake, who asked quietly, "Are you going to keep it?" And I said, "I don't know. Maybe donate it to my women's fund in their name." And the rightness of that decision settled over me immediately. And Jake said, "That's generous." But I shook my head and told him, "It's strategic. They can see what that money becomes when it helps people." Because I wanted my parents to understand that wealth was about more than personal accumulation. It was about impact and purpose. The limousine drove through the darkening streets toward the airport where our first-class tickets to Italy waited. And I leaned against Jake's shoulder and reflected on how much had changed in just 3 months, how I had gone from being dismissed and diminished and told my wedding was a circus to sitting here married to a man who truly loved me, financially independent, professionally respected, and most importantly self-assured in a way I had never been before. But questions still lingered in my mind about whether my parents would really change, whether the tears and apologies I'd seen tonight were genuine transformation or temporary emotion, whether family relationships that had been broken for so long could truly be rebuilt on a new foundation of mutual respect and recognition. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Jake and I were settled into our new home, a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a quiet Chicago suburb that we'd purchased for $1.2 million. And the space felt like ours in a way that went beyond ownership, because every room reflected choices we'd made together without anyone else's input or judgment. My venture capital firm had officially launched 3 months after we returned from our honeymoon in Italy, and already we had funded 8 women-owned businesses, ranging from a tech startup created by a single mother to a sustainable fashion company run by 2 sisters who had been turned down by every traditional investor they'd approached. And the local and national press coverage of the fund had been more extensive than I'd anticipated, with features in Forbes and Entrepreneur magazine highlighting my mission to create opportunities for women who faced the same barriers I had overcome. My mother called weekly now, and these conversations were different from any we'd had before, because she actually asked about my life and my work, and listened to the answers instead of waiting for her turn to talk about Brett or offer unsolicited advice. And while the conversations were still sometimes awkward with pauses where neither of us quite knew what to say, they were improving steadily and felt like genuine attempts at connection. She had attended my fund's launch event 2 months ago and brought several of her friends from her social circle, and I had watched with surprise and complicated emotions as she introduced me to them, saying, "My daughter, the entrepreneur," with unmistakable pride in her voice. And while it was a small moment, it felt significant because it was the first time I could remember her claiming my achievements publicly. My father had sent the article about my firm from the Chicago Tribune to his golf buddies, and when I'd called to thank him for his support, he'd said quietly, "I should have been doing this all along." And those words had meant more than I expected them to. Brett was working seriously for the first time in his life at a sales position with a medical supply company, and he was actually doing well with consistent performance and positive reviews from his manager. And he had told me over one of our monthly lunches, "You showed me what accountability looks like," and I could see that he genuinely meant it, that our confrontation at the wedding had forced him to examine his own choices and patterns. Stephanie had become an unexpected ally and now volunteered at my women's fund twice a week, helping with grant applications and mentorship programs. and her presence had helped Brett and me rebuild our sibling relationship slowly and carefully with honesty that had never existed between us before. The $40,000 my parents had given me on my wedding night had been donated to the fund exactly as I'd planned, and I'd named it the Margaret and Robert Chen Fund for Women Entrepreneurs. And when my mother learned what I'd done, she had cried and said, "I don't deserve this." And I had told her, "It's not about deserving, it's about what we do next." And she had nodded in understanding. My parents were now volunteering at fund events, and my mother had become particularly involved in the mentorship program, where she worked with young women on professional presentation and networking, and watching her use her social skills to help others, instead of to judge and criticize, felt like witnessing a genuine transformation. And while our relationship wasn't perfect, it was healing in ways I hadn't thought possible 6 months ago. Jake had been promoted to department head at his school and was thriving in the additional responsibility, and he remained as passionate about teaching as ever and never showed any sign of being intimidated by my success or the attention my work received. And our partnership felt beautifully balanced, with my business acumen complementing his emotional intelligence and his steadiness grounding my ambition. I was 3 months pregnant now, though not yet showing, and Jake and I had kept this news private while we adjusted to the reality of becoming parents. But we had decided it was time to share it with our families, and we'd planned to tell everyone at our Sunday dinner tonight because that had become a new tradition, with my parents and Brett and Stephanie joining us every other week for a meal that felt imperfect but authentic. I was nervous about my parents' involvement with our child, worried that old patterns might resurface around grandparenting, but I was also hopeful because they had demonstrated real change over these past months, and I wanted to believe that change would continue. As I prepared dinner that evening and set the table for 6, soon to be 7, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from being the overlooked daughter who couldn't do anything right to building a multi-million-dollar company and a life that felt genuinely mine. And I understood now that I had never needed my parents' approval to be successful or happy, but having their recognition and support now felt healing in ways I hadn't expected. And I also understood that setting boundaries at the wedding had actually saved our relationships, because if I had stayed silent and continued to accept their treatment, the resentment would have destroyed everything eventually. The doorbell rang and I opened it to find my parents standing there with a bouquet of flowers, and my mother smiled and said, "Your home is just beautiful, Emily," with genuine warmth, and my father asked, "How's the fund going?" with real interest in his voice. And these small gestures of attention and affection that had once been so rare now came more naturally, though still with effort on both sides. Brett and Stephanie arrived moments later, and we gathered around the dinner table in our dining room. And the conversation flowed more easily than it once had, with discussions of work and future plans and shared stories. And after we'd finished eating, I looked at Jake, and he nodded encouragingly, and I said, "We have some news to share," and my mother's face lit up with anticipation, and I told them, "We're expecting a baby, I'm 3 months along." And my mother's immediate reaction was joy and tears, and she reached across the table to take my hand and asked, "What do you need? How can we help?" And I noticed that she didn't try to take over or offer unsolicited advice. She simply asked what I needed and waited for my answer. And in that moment, I realized this was what I had always wanted, not the money or the public validation or even the apology, but simply to be seen and valued and loved for who I was. My mother called my wedding a circus, and she thought I couldn't survive without her money or her approval or her control, and she was wrong about all of it. But proving her wrong wasn't the victory I had imagined, because the real victory was learning that I never needed to prove anything at all. I just needed to know my own worth, and everything else followed from that understanding. And now, sitting at this table with Jake beside me, and our child growing inside me, and a family that was finally learning to really see me, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving on my own terms, finally and completely. And the future stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise, and the kind of peace that comes from being fully yourself without apology or compromise.